Chris walked into the new school with his sunglasses firmly in place, his jaw tight and his mind set on one thing: staying out of trouble. He couldn't afford to screw this up. His mother's promise echoed in his head. No more fights, no more trouble, and he'd finally get the Porsche she dangled like a carrot. This was his fresh start, a chance to be someone different. But as he strolled through the crowded hallways, the whispers and curious glances from the students were hard to ignore. None of them could know anything about his past, about how he used to fight at school every day, or how dangerous he had become recently, causing his hasty transfer. He wasn't here to be dangerous, not anymore. He'd made a deal with his mom, and he planned on keeping it, no matter what. But then it happened. As he navigated the unfamiliar hallways, he accidentally bumped into someone. It wasn't just anyone. She was the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen. The moment their shoulders brushed, it felt like the air around him thickened. He barely noticed that he'd knocked her books to the floor, his entire focus locked on her. She was stunning. A black-as-night girl with short, intricately twisted dreadlocks that framed her face like a crown. Her skin was smooth and deep brown, like rich chocolate, and her eyes held a warmth that made his chest tighten. Chris stood frozen for a moment, taking her in, barely breathing as he marveled at how someone could be so perfect. "I'm so sorry," he mumbled, dropping to his knees to help pick up her books. But before he could say more, another voice cut through the moment, a harsh, mocking tone that shattered the peaceful vibe. "Watch where you're going, stupid," the guy growled, kicking Chris square in the back as he was still on the floor. Chris flinched but held his breath. His muscles coiled, his fists clenched instinctively. He'd been hit worse, but the fire rising in him was undeniable. No one kicked him and got away with it. The voice belonged to the girl's boyfriend. Chris didn't need to turn around to know what kind of guy he was. Arrogant, controlling, the kind that got off on bullying people. The guy's next words made Chris grind his teeth. "What are you, blind?" the bully sneered, making a show of his disdain. Chris's hands balled into fists at his sides. It took every ounce of restraint not to snap. Not here, not now. His mother's words came rushing back like a lifeline, anchoring him, keeping his rage at bay. Before Chris could react, his friend Jamal rushed over. He knew Chris's temper better than anyone and saw the warning signs. "Sorry, man," Jamal said quickly, stepping between Chris and the boyfriend. "He's blind. Didn't mean to bump into your girl." The silence that followed was deafening. Chris blinked from behind his sunglasses, unsure of how to respond. Blind? Jamal's quick thinking was impressive, but also ridiculous. Chris was about to speak up, but the bully's next words stopped him. "Blind, huh?" the boyfriend snorted, looking at Chris as though he were suddenly less of a threat. "Figures." The girl, however, looked horrified. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I should have been paying more attention." She reached out, her gentle fingers brushing against his arm, and for a moment, Chris forgot how to breathe. Her touch was soft, and her voice kind. He couldn't believe how easily she believed the lie, but part of him didn't mind. Her boyfriend was still glaring at him, but she pulled him away, apologizing to Chris the entire time. As they walked off, Jamal helped him up, smirking. "That was close, bro. You almost lost it, but now you've got a whole new angle. You're welcome." Chris brushed off his jeans, but a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "You know what? You might have just given me the best idea ever." From that day on, Chris embraced the lie. Pretending to be blind became his ticket to getting closer to the girl. Every day he would wear his sunglasses and pretend to stumble around, putting himself in positions where she felt compelled to help him. It was risky, but each moment spent with her was worth it. She was kind, always asking if he needed anything, and her boyfriend, though still an obnoxious jerk, was none the wiser. And as the days passed, Chris found himself falling for her harder and faster than he ever thought possible. Every moment he spent pretending not to see her was a challenge because, in reality, he couldn't take his eyes off her. Through the tinted lenses of his sunglasses, he admired everything about her, the way her laughter softened her features, the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke. She was everything he never knew he wanted, and it was getting harder to keep his secret. Chris continued to master his role. But every time Zara walked beside him, guiding him through the halls, the weight of his lie grew heavier. She was nothing like the girls he'd known before. She was real, sweet, and so attentive that it almost made him forget he wasn't actually blind. Almost. But then she'd glance at him, her brown eyes filled with concern, and he'd remember why he was doing this. Zara was trapped in a toxic relationship, and as far as Chris was concerned, he was the only one who could help her. Her boyfriend Trey was another story. Trey was the kind of guy who thought he owned the world, or at least Zara. He played football, strutted through the hallways with his chest out, and treated anyone smaller or weaker than him like trash. Most people stayed out of his way, but Chris... Well, Chris didn't have that luxury anymore. Trey took every opportunity to mess with him. Whether it was knocking Chris's books out of his hands or accidentally bumping into him in the cafeteria, Trey made sure Chris remembered who was in charge, and every time Chris would grit his teeth, clenching his fists under the table, reminding himself of his promise to his mom. One more fight, and the Porsche was gone. Zara would always step in, her hand resting lightly on Chris's arm, offering a soft smile. "Don't let him get to you. He's just Trey." It made Chris burn inside to see how easily she brushed off Trey's behavior, as if it was something she had to endure. Over the next few weeks, Chris found out more about Zara, her favorite music, her plans to go to college, the way she loved poetry but hated chemistry. She shared bits and pieces of her life, and the more she opened up, the deeper Chris fell. He could see it in her eyes, though. She was unhappy. And Trey wasn't just a bad boyfriend. He was controlling. Chris began to notice the subtle signs. The way she flinched when Trey raised his voice. How she nervously tugged at her sleeves when anyone mentioned him. Then one day, he saw a bruise on her arm. They were sitting outside on the bleachers after school, and Zara was laughing at something Jamal had said when her sleeve slipped up just enough to reveal a purple mark. Chris's stomach dropped. It wasn't just the bullying, it was worse than that. Trey was hitting her. Chris's heart pounded as he clenched his hands into fists. His vision blurred, and for a second, he had to remind himself to breathe. He wanted nothing more than to march up to Trey and put him in his place. But he couldn't. He was stuck pretending, and worse, he had promised not to fight. Still, the anger gnawed at him. That night, as Chris lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, he couldn't stop replaying the moment in his mind. The bruise. Zara's soft laugh. The way she acted like everything was normal when nothing about it was okay. The next day, Chris was walking through the hallway, pretending to stumble slightly as Zara guided him. She was talking about her plans for the weekend, but Chris's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Trey. Zara deserved better, and it was eating him up inside to watch her suffer. And then it happened. Chris was waiting by the lockers after school when he saw Trey grab Zara's arm, pulling her away from a group of friends. They were arguing, Trey's voice low and dangerous. Chris moved closer, trying to hear without drawing attention. But then Trey did something that made his blood boil. He slapped her. It wasn't a hard slap, but it was enough to make Zara wince, her hand flying to her cheek in shock. Before Chris could even think, his body reacted. In one swift motion, he stepped forward and grabbed Trey's wrist, stopping him just as he was about to strike Zara again. For a moment, there was silence. Trey looked stunned, his eyes wide with confusion. "What the hell?" Trey sputtered. "How did you—" Chris stood tall, his grip tightening on Trey's wrist. "I'm not as blind as you think." Trey yanked his hand back, throwing a punch aimed at Chris's face, but Chris was ready. He caught the punch effortlessly, twisting Trey's arm behind his back and shoving him into the lockers. A crowd had gathered now, students whispering in awe at the scene unfolding before them. Chris didn't let up. Trey threw another punch, and again, Chris caught it, his strength undeniable. With one swift motion, he overpowered Trey, grabbing him by the collar and throwing him into a nearby rubbish bin. The crowd erupted in gasps and laughter. But Chris didn't care. His heart was pounding, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He'd just broken his promise. But it didn't matter. Not in that moment. All he could think about was Zara. He turned to her, his chest heaving with the effort to calm himself down. She was staring at him, her hand still pressed to her cheek, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock, fear, and something else. Betrayal. You can see? she whispered. Chris opened his mouth to explain, but no words came out. He watched as her expression shifted from confusion to hurt, and it hit him like a punch to the gut. She didn't look relieved or happy. She looked betrayed. "I was just trying to," he started, but she shook her head, stepping back. "You lied to me, Chris," Zara whispered, her voice barely audible. "You've been lying to me this whole time." Chris stood frozen as the reality of the situation sank in. Zara's eyes shimmered with a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite decipher: hurt, confusion, betrayal. He had never meant for this to happen. Everything about his plan had been about getting closer to her, protecting her. But now it felt like he had done the exact opposite. "Zara, His voice faltered as he took a step closer. She stepped back, her arms wrapping around herself protectively. "You've been lying to me this whole time?" she repeated, her voice trembling. But this time it wasn't just shock, it was anger. "All those times I helped you, all those times I defended you against Trey. I thought you needed me. I thought you..." She cut herself off, biting her lip as her eyes welled up with tears. "You made me look like a fool." Chris's heart broke at the sight of her. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said, his voice soft but earnest. "I didn't know how to get close to you. And then Trey. Zara, I saw how he was treating you and I just..." "You lied, Chris," she interrupted, her voice sharp now. "That's all I need to know. I trusted you." He could see it in her eyes. The walls she had built up over time, the ones that protected her from people like Trey, were now rising up between them. Chris didn't know what to say. He had saved her, hadn't he? But he had also deceived her, and that part he couldn't fix with a few words. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Chris said quietly. "I didn't want you to get hurt." Zara wiped away a tear before it could fall. "But I did get hurt, Chris. You were just like him, pretending to be something you're not." Her voice cracked, and she shook her head as if trying to push the emotions back. "I need time to think." Before Chris could say another word, Zara turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the hallway. The students who had gathered to watch the fight were slowly dispersing, but their whispers followed her as she hurried down the hall. Chris stood there, feeling the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He had protected her from Trey, but in doing so, he had become another person in her life who let her down. The realization stung. He had broken her trust, and for what? A lie that spiraled out of control. For days, Zara avoided him. She barely looked his way in the halls, and when she did, it was with an expression that pierced him to his core. Chris tried reaching out, texting her, even approaching her a few times, but she either ignored him or brushed him off, saying she needed space. He gave her that space, but it killed him. Seeing her walk past without stopping to say hi or offer him that sweet, gentle smile tore at him. He missed her, missed their conversations, missed the way her presence made him feel lighter, even if it was all built on a lie. Trey had been suspended after the fight, and word had spread quickly about what had happened. Some students thought Chris was a hero, while others couldn't believe he'd lied about being blind. But none of their opinions mattered to him, only Zara's did. A week passed before Chris got the courage to approach Zara again. She was sitting alone on the bleachers after school, her head bowed as she flipped through her notebook. Chris walked over slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He had rehearsed what he would say 1,000 times in his head, but now that he was standing in front of her, every word seemed to slip away. Zara didn't look up when he stopped next to her, but he could tell she knew he was there. "Zara, can we talk?" he asked quietly. She hesitated before sighing, closing her notebook and looking up at him. Her face was tired, the pain of the past week still evident in her eyes. "What is there to talk about, Chris?" "I know I messed up," he said, sitting down beside her. "I know I shouldn't have lied to you, and I'm sorry for that, but I swear everything else was real. How I feel about you, that's real." Zara shook her head, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "How can I trust that, Chris? How can I believe anything you say after all of this?" Chris exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know how to make it up to you. I really don't. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I care about you, Zara. More than I've cared about anyone in a long time. And I just want to prove that to you." For a moment, Zara was silent. Her eyes searched his face, looking for something. Maybe sincerity, maybe remorse. Whatever it was, Chris hoped she found it because everything he said was true. He had never wanted to hurt her. He just wanted to protect her, to be someone she could rely on. "I don't know if it's that simple, Chris," she said softly. "You made me believe I was helping you, but all along I was just part of your game. You made me think we were friends." "We are friends," he said, his voice desperate now. "I never wanted to play games with you. I just wanted to be near you." Zara sighed, leaning back against the bleachers. "I don't know, Chris. I need time to figure this out. I need to think about whether I can trust you again." Chris nodded slowly, his heart sinking. "Take all the time you need. I'll wait." She looked at him, and for the first time in days, he saw a flicker of the warmth she used to give him. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small hope that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't lost her completely. The days following their conversation were agonizing for Chris. He gave Zara the space she asked for, but it didn't make it any easier. Every time he saw her in the hall, talking to friends or just walking alone, his heart twisted with guilt. He wanted to fix things, but he had to let her come to terms with what happened on her own. Meanwhile, the rumors around school continued to swirl. People still talked about how he'd pretended to be blind, how he'd taken down Trey in front of everyone. Some of the girls thought it was romantic that he had fought for Zara, but Chris knew the truth. It wasn't a fairy tale. He had hurt Zara, and that was what mattered most. Then, one afternoon, as Chris was walking to his car, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Chris." He turned around to see Zara standing there, her arms crossed over her chest. Her expression wasn't as closed off as it had been before, but there was still caution in her eyes. She took a deep breath before walking up to him. "Can we talk?" she asked. Chris nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Of course." They found a quiet spot near the edge of the school's football field, away from prying eyes. Chris waited, his stomach in knots, while Zara gathered her thoughts. "I've been thinking," she started, her voice soft, "about everything, about what happened and how I feel about it." Chris nodded, staying silent, knowing that this was her moment to say what she needed to. "I was really hurt when I found out you weren't blind," she said, meeting his eyes. "I felt like everything I did for you was based on a lie. But after thinking it over, I realized that maybe it wasn't all a lie." Chris's heart raced. "What do you mean?" Zara sighed, her gaze drifting out over the field. "You didn't have to step in that day, Chris. You didn't have to protect me from Trey. But you did. And I've seen how you've been with me these past few weeks. You could have told me the truth, but you didn't because you were scared, weren't you?" Chris swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah, I was scared. I didn't want to lose you, Zara. I didn't know how to get close to you without messing everything up." Zara glanced back at him, her eyes softer now. "I get that. I'm still hurt by what you did, but I also understand why you did it. And part of me believes that what we had was real, even if it started with a lie." Chris's chest tightened. "It was real, Zara. I swear it was." She took a step closer, her expression conflicted. "I don't know if I can fully trust you yet, Chris, but I'm willing to try. I don't want to lose whatever this is between us." Chris felt a rush of relief wash over him. "I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust back." "I promise," Zara nodded, a small tentative smile tugging at her lips. "One step at a time, okay?" "Okay," Chris agreed, his heart swelling with hope. For the first time in weeks, Chris felt like maybe things could work out between them. It wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to prove himself, to show Zara that he was more than the mistakes he'd made. He cared about her, more than anything, and he wasn't going to let her down again. They stood there in silence for a moment, the tension between them easing. but not completely gone. There was still a long road ahead, but at least they were taking the first step. Zara glanced up at him, her eyes searching his face. "By the way," she said, her tone light, "do you ever take off those sunglasses?" Chris chuckled, relieved by the playful shift in her mood. "Only if you ask nicely." She smiled, really smiled this time, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Chris felt like everything might be okay. It was a start, and that was all he needed. Weeks later, things were still tense between Chris and Zara, but their relationship had begun to grow in new ways. They took it slow, rebuilding the trust that had been lost. Zara wasn't ready to call it a relationship, not yet, but the connection between them was undeniable. Trey had been suspended for longer than expected, and rumors swirled that his parents were considering moving him to another school. It was a relief for Zara, and it meant she could finally breathe again. Chris stayed true to his promise, not just to Zara, but to his mother as well. No more fights, no more drama. He'd earned his Porsche, but more importantly, he'd earned Zara's respect little by little, with every passing day. One afternoon, as they sat together on the bleachers after school, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Zara leaned her head on Chris's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but to Chris, it meant everything. He turned his head slightly, his sunglasses resting on his nose as he looked down at her. "You know," he said softly, "I'm really glad I bumped into you that day." Zara chuckled, her voice light. "Even if I thought you were blind?" Chris smiled, a warmth spreading through his chest. "Even then." She tilted her head up, meeting his gaze with a soft smile of her own. "Me too." In that moment, Chris knew they would be okay. There were no more lies between them, no more secrets, just the beginning of something real. And as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the field, Chris felt like, for the first time in a long time, he was exactly where he was supposed to be.